I spent 3 years building a life with a woman who was quietly dismantling it one decision at a time, and I didn't figure out the full picture until our savings were gone, and she was accusing me of things I hadn't done. By the time the truth came out at a party in front of everyone we knew, there was nothing left to save except myself. The moment I knew it was really over wasn't when I found out about the money. It wasn't even when I found out about the men. It was when she looked me dead in the eye at Jamie and Kyra's house party, with about 15 people standing close enough to hear every word, and told me I was the problem in our relationship. She said it with this absolute calm, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd been waiting for the right audience. That was Simone. That was always Simone right up until the end. I've been trying to write this out for about 3 months now. I've started it maybe 4 times and deleted everything because I kept second-guessing how much detail to include, whether I was being fair, whether I was making myself sound too much like a victim. But here's what I finally landed on. I'm going to tell it straight, every part of it, and whoever reads this can decide what they think. My name is Callum. I was 28 when I met Simone and 32 by the time I finally understood who she was. 4 years of my life. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because you should understand the timeline before you can understand what it cost. I met her through a friend group that no longer exists the way it used to. We had this loose circle, people from various parts of our lives who'd converged, the way circles do in your late 20s. Simone was dating someone loosely connected to that group. I barely noticed her at first. That changed over a summer. A series of overlapping events, barbecues, a trip to the lake, someone's cousin's outdoor wedding that half the group ended up at. Somewhere in that stretch, she stopped being someone on the periphery and became someone I was actively looking for when I walked into a room. She was magnetic. That's not an exaggeration or nostalgia. She had this energy where she could walk into a room and adjust the temperature. She was funny in a way that was a little sharp, like she was always half a second ahead of the joke and choosing whether to let you in on it. She made you feel chosen when she turned that attention toward you. She was single by August. I asked her out in September. She said yes like it was already decided. We dated for a year before we moved in together. That year was, genuinely, some of the best I'd had. She was interesting. She had opinions about things and she could argue them without getting ugly. She cooked badly but tried enthusiastically. She remembered things I said weeks after I said them. She showed up. I want to say all of this clearly because I'm not someone who looks back and thinks the whole thing was a lie from the start. I don't think that. I think she was real with me, or at least mostly real for a while. I think whatever happened later was a shift, not a mask being removed. That's important to me. It means I wasn't completely blind. It means there was actually something worth loving before it changed. The first thing I should have paid more attention to was how she talked about her past relationships. She'd had a long-term relationship before me, about 3 years. It ended, she said, because she'd been too young and too constrained. She used that word a lot, constrained. Like she'd been trapped somehow, like the relationship itself had been a cage. I asked her what he'd done that made her feel constrained. She said it wasn't anything he did exactly. It was just that she needed room to be herself, to grow, to not have to explain every choice. At the time I heard that as reasonable. Who doesn't want to be with someone who gives them space? I told myself I was different, that I wasn't going to smother her, that I understood what she needed. I didn't understand what she was actually telling me. What she was actually telling me was that accountability felt like a cage to her. That being with someone who had expectations of her felt like oppression. That she had decided, somewhere along the way, that her growth was the highest priority in any relationship, and anything or anyone that complicated that growth was the problem. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. We moved into a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood we both liked, about 18 months after we started dating. We'd been saving together for about 6 months at that point, a joint savings account she'd suggested. We both put in a set amount each month. It was for a future we talked about in specific terms, eventually a down payment on something, a real trip we'd been planning to Southeast Asia, maybe a ring at some point. The joint account was her idea. She brought it up, set it up, made it feel like a symbol of something. I matched her contributions every month without thinking twice. The first real cracks showed up around month 8 of living together. She started going on trips. Not with me, with her girlfriends, which was completely fine at first. She had a tight group of friends she'd known since college, and they did a trip together every year or so. I had no issue with that. I encouraged it honestly because I'm not someone who needs to be attached at the hip. The first trip was a long weekend to Nashville. She planned it, went, came back happy. Normal. The second trip was 6 days in Cancun. Also fine. A little longer, a little more expensive, but she said she was using her own money. The third trip I found out later was Lisbon, 10 days, business class flights, a boutique hotel. She told me she was going on a trip with the girls for about 2 weeks. She did not tell me it was Lisbon. She did not tell me it was business class. And she did not tell me it was charged to our joint account. I found out when I went to check our balance to make sure we were on track for the Southeast Asia trip we'd been planning together. We'd been building that account for almost 2 years. It should have had around 18,000 in it. It had 4,200. I sat in front of my laptop for a long time, going through the transaction history. I was doing math in my head that didn't come out right no matter how many times I ran it. Flight charges, hotel charges, restaurant charges I didn't recognize, charges in cities I hadn't been to with her, a wine tour, a private boat thing. This wasn't just Lisbon. This was months of trips that she'd either told me were cheaper than they were or hadn't mentioned fully. The account had been draining in increments, some big and obvious, some small enough that I hadn't noticed them until I looked at the whole picture. I called her while she was still in whatever city she was in. She picked up sounding relaxed. I could hear background noise, voices, something that sounded like an outdoor terrace. I said, "Can you tell me about the joint account?" She said, "What about it?" I said, "There's 4,000 in it. There should be 18. She paused, not long, then she said, "I've been using it for trips. I told you I was going on trips." I said, "You said you were using your own money." She said, "I don't think I said that." I said, "Simone." She said, "Can we talk about this when I get back? I don't want to do this right now." And that was it. She went back to her terrace and her wine and her boat tour, and I sat there with the laptop in front of me and a number in my head that felt like something had been removed from me without anesthesia. Looking back, that should have been the end of it. I know that. But she was still on that trip and I had 3 more days to sit with it before she came back. And by the time she walked through the door, I had gone through approximately 900 emotional cycles and landed somewhere that was more confused than resolved. She came in with a tan and a tote bag full of gifts for me. Small things. Wine, a ceramic dish, a little leather pouch she'd found at a market. She set them on the counter with this careful, apologetic energy that told me she'd been thinking about how to play this for the entire flight home. She sat down and said, "I know I should have been clearer." I said, $14,000, Simone. She said, "I know." I said, "That was supposed to be for us." She said, "I know. I got caught up in wanting to do these things while I still could. I didn't think it through the way I should have." And then she said the thing that I let derail me. She said, "I've been feeling really lost lately, like I needed to reconnect with who I am outside of us. I'm not trying to blame the relationship, but I think I needed this." I heard that and something in me tilted. Not in agreement, exactly. More like the conversation shifted from what she'd done to who she was, and suddenly I was in the position of either accepting that framing or coming across as someone who didn't care about her inner life. I didn't confront it properly. I asked her to pay back what she could over time. She said she would. She didn't, but I let it settle into the background rather than treating it as the bright red signal it was. The thing about the trips was that they were a symptom. The actual disease was the way she made decisions, unilaterally, about everything, and then described it as equality after the fact. She picked where we ate without asking, and then said she was just being decisive. She made plans for our weekends and then framed them as things she thought I'd like. She adjusted our shared schedule to accommodate her work events without checking whether I had anything going on, and then acted confused when I mentioned that I'd had plans. Every time I raised any of this, she had a version of it ready where she'd actually been trying to serve us both, and I just hadn't seen it clearly enough. I made that reservation because I know you love Italian, and I wanted to do something nice for you. I thought you said you didn't have anything that Saturday. You always say you don't care where we go, so I just decided. None of it was shouted. It was all delivered calmly, reasonably, in a tone that made me feel like I was being difficult for even bringing it up. I started doubting my own perception of things. That's the honest truth. I would come into a conversation certain that I had a legitimate point and leave it wondering if I'd manufactured the grievance. It took me a while to notice the other thing, the infidelity. I want to be careful here because I'm talking about things I can't verify from memory alone, but I'll tell you what I know. About 2 years into living together, Simone started mentioning a man named Theo. She'd met him at a work event. They were in adjacent industries and had started talking professionally. She mentioned him casually, the way you mention a colleague, nothing alarming. But she mentioned him a lot across months. Little references, his opinion on something, a podcast he'd recommended, a restaurant he'd been to. I said once, trying to keep it light, Theo sounds like he's becoming a close friend. She said, he's just someone I talk to. You're not threatened by me having male friends, are you? I said no, I wasn't. I believed in that. I didn't want to be the guy who monitored his girlfriend's friendships. But then she came home once just slightly off. Not drunk, not disheveled, just slightly not quite right in a way I couldn't name. She said she'd been at a work thing. She went straight to the shower. I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid. I made excuses for the small wrongnesses that were stacking up, and I stacked them in a pile somewhere in the back of my head and refused to go near it. The trip money hadn't been paid back. The trips hadn't stopped. She just stopped mentioning the costs as clearly. I think by the time we'd been together 3.5 years, something in me had quietly given up without telling the rest of me. I was going through the motions of the relationship with this low-grade numbness that I kept misidentifying as contentment. I told myself things were fine. I kept us on a surface where nothing too big had to be faced. And then she told me she wanted us to have a conversation about what monogamy meant to us. She said it at dinner, on a Wednesday, with the careful tone of someone who had prepared. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking about what she needed to feel fully alive in a relationship. She said she wasn't unhappy with me. That wasn't what this was. But she said she felt like she'd been suppressing parts of herself, and she wanted us to talk about whether our current structure was working for her. I sat across from her, and the pile in the back of my head started to come apart. I said, "What are you actually telling me right now?" She said, "I'm telling you I need more room to explore." I said, "Have you already been exploring?" She looked at me for a second and said, "I've made some choices that I don't feel were wrong, but that I should have talked to you about first." That was her version of a confession. Some choices that she didn't feel were wrong. Not an apology. Not even an acknowledgement of the specific weight of what she was saying. Just a reframe where she was someone on a journey and I was the person who hadn't kept up. I asked her about Theo. She didn't deny it. She said it was more complicated than I was framing it. I asked her how many times. She said the number wasn't the point. I said it's the point to me. She said, "This is exactly what I mean. You're making this into a moral failing when it's really about me figuring out who I am. I left the table. I slept in the second bedroom. And the next morning I called a friend and told him everything and cried in a way I hadn't done in years. And he listened. And at the end he said, "Man, you needed to hear yourself say all of that out loud." He was right. I had needed to hear it. The party happened about 2 weeks later. I should have canceled. I knew it was going to be a loaded environment. But Jamie and Kyra had been planning it for months, and they were mutual friends, closer to me honestly than to Simone, and I wasn't ready to start rearranging my social life around her. I told Simone we didn't have to go together, that we could arrive separately, keep things low-key. She said she wanted to go together. She said it was important that we present a united front while we figured things out. I should have known what that meant. United front for whom? We weren't figuring things out. We were, at least in my mind, waiting for me to be ready to say what I already knew. We arrived together. The house was full. Maybe 20, 25 people. Music at a level where you had to lean in a little to talk. Good energy, mostly. People I'd known for years. I was doing fine for the first hour. I kept my distance from Simone without making it obvious. I talked to people I genuinely liked. I had a couple of drinks. Then I was standing in the kitchen talking to Jamie when Simone came in with two of her friends. She was telling them something. I couldn't hear it over the music, but I caught the tone. Performative. The tone she used when she was delivering a version of something. One of her friends glanced at me in a way that had a little too much in it. Not hostile. More like she just heard something about me that she was now cross-referencing against what she was seeing. I asked Jamie quietly, "Do you know if she's been talking to people tonight?" Jamie made a face. He said, "She's been going around telling people you've been making her life really difficult, that you've been checking up on her constantly, going through her phone." I stood there for a second. I had never gone through her phone. I had never checked up on her. I had barely asked follow-up questions when she came home late because I'd been so conditioned to feel like asking questions was a violation. I walked into the living room. Simone was in a little cluster of people, mid-conversation, animated. When she saw me, she shifted slightly. A micro-adjustment, her body reading the room. I said, "Can I talk to you for a second?" She said, "I'm in the middle of something." I said, "It'll be quick." She said, "Callum, this isn't the place." And something in me, 3.5 years of swallowed conversations, of tilted realities, of a savings account that had been quietly emptied, of a man named Theo, of choices she hadn't felt were wrong, it reached a limit. I said, "You're telling people I've been going through your phone." She said, "I said you've been acting paranoid and controlling. That's true." I said, "I've never touched your phone." She said, "You've made me feel watched." The people around us had gone quiet. I was aware of it, but I kept going. I said, "You spent $14,000 from our savings account without asking me, on trips, on flights and hotels that I didn't know about." She said, "I explained that." I said, "You explained that you needed to reconnect with yourself. You didn't explain Theo." The room got quieter. She said quietly, "Don't do this here." I said, "You're already doing it here. You've been doing it for the last hour. I just want the same people who heard your version to hear mine." I wasn't yelling. I want to be clear about that because the way I'm describing it might sound like I was. I was level. Probably too level, actually. The kind of level that comes from being well past the point of emotion and into something colder. I told them, the people who were close enough to hear, which was maybe 8 or 10 people at that point, about the savings account. The actual number, the trips, the conversation where she'd said she'd made choices she didn't think were wrong. I didn't editorialize, I just said what happened. Simone tried to interrupt twice. The second time, Kyra, who was standing to my left and had known me for 6 years, said, gently but clearly, "Let him finish." When I was done, there was a moment of quiet. Simone said, "You're painting this as much worse than it is." Someone I didn't know well said, "I mean, that sounds pretty bad." Simone looked around the room, and I watched her face do something I'd never seen it do before. The performance slipped. The careful composure she always had, the way she could reframe anything in real time, it slipped. Just for a second, but everyone in that cluster saw it. She left about 10 minutes later. I stayed. I drank water. I talked to Jamie and Kyra for a while about normal things because I desperately needed something normal. And Jamie said, at some point, "I heard some stuff from some of her friends before. I wish I'd said something to you sooner." I told him it wasn't his responsibility. I meant it. The aftermath came in stages. The first stage was the harassment. About a week after the party, she started messaging people. Her friends, some of our mutual friends, people she barely knew. Long messages about what I'd supposedly done to her. The accusations she'd been floating got more specific and more serious. She was saying I'd been emotionally abusive, that I'd isolated her, that the confrontation at the party was an example of me trying to publicly humiliate her. Some people believed her, at least initially. She was persuasive. She'd had years of practice at being persuasive. And then she made a mistake. She told someone, a friend of a friend, that she had evidence of the things she was claiming, that she documented incidents. She implied there might be formal complaints coming. I didn't know what she had or hadn't documented. But the word evidence scared me in a specific way, because when someone who has been reframing your entire relationship tells people they have evidence of things that aren't true, you suddenly feel very exposed and very helpless. A friend of mine knew a detective, not someone with any jurisdiction over civil matters, just someone with investigative experience who helped people in gray area situations like this. His name was Ray. My friend connected us. I told Ray everything. He listened the way investigators listen, without judgment but also without reassurance. He asked me methodical questions. He asked whether I had any documentation of anything, texts, emails, financial records. I had the savings account statements. I had some texts, including the one where she'd said she'd made some choices she hadn't felt were wrong. Ray looked at what I had and said the financial documentation was solid. He said what she was doing, implying formal complaints, using the word evidence in messages to third parties, walked a line that she probably didn't understand she was walking. He said if she made any formal claim, I'd be in a strong position. He also helped me organize and timestamp what I had, so that if anything escalated, my version of events was documented first. It didn't escalate. She never made a formal complaint. I think somewhere along the way she realized that any formal process would also surface what I had, and the story she'd been telling about me as an abusive, controlling boyfriend wouldn't survive contact with a savings account statement. The messaging campaign faded out over about 3 weeks. What didn't fade out as quickly was the friend group situation. Some of the mutual friends, the ones who'd been at the party or heard her version before they'd heard mine, had to process what they knew in their own time. A few of them reached out to me. A few of them drifted from both of us and just became distant. But the core of it, the people who'd been in that kitchen and living room at Jamie and Kyra's place, who'd heard what I said and watched her face, they made their call. Simone's two closest friends from that circle stopped spending time with her, not in a dramatic way, no public statement, just a slow withdrawal, invitations not extended, messages not returned at the usual speed and then not at all. One of them told me later, months after, that they'd known about the money before I did. That Simone had told them, framed as a funny story about how she'd found a workaround. They'd felt uncomfortable with it at the time and hadn't known what to do with that discomfort. The party was the moment where they decided they knew enough. Simone ended up in a different social circle. I don't know much about who she is now or what her life looks like. I'm not tracking it. The apartment thing sorted itself out faster than I expected. Our lease was up 3 months after the party, and neither of us wanted to renew. We split the remaining contents of the joint account, what was left of it, and went our separate ways without a lawyer, which was probably more than she deserved but less drama than I wanted. I need to tell you about the year after that. Because I said in the beginning that I'm a guy who had to rebuild his self-worth after this relationship, and I want to be honest about what that actually looked like. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a montage of gym sessions and therapy breakthroughs, and then everything was fine. I moved into a smaller apartment by myself, and I spent the first 2 months in a state I can only describe as fog. Not depressed exactly, or maybe exactly depressed, but more like disoriented. Like I'd been navigating with a map that turned out to be upside down, and now I didn't trust my own sense of direction. I second-guessed things constantly. Not about whether I'd been right to end it, I knew I had been, but about my own judgment, about how I'd missed so much for so long, about how I'd let my account be drained and my reality be rewritten and my self-perception be slowly managed, and how I just kept accommodating it because I loved her, and because I wanted to believe in the version of her I'd first known. I went to therapy. I'm not going to go into the details of that because it's private and also because the details aren't the point. The point is that I had to learn to trust my own perceptions again. That sounds simple. It wasn't. When you've spent years having your observations gently corrected by someone who seemed smarter and more composed than you stop trusting that what you see is what's actually there. I had to relearn that, deliberately, in sessions and outside of them. Little exercises in trusting myself, noticing a thing, checking it, validating my own read. Work helped. I threw myself into it, not in a destructive way, just in a focusing way. I got a promotion about 8 months after the breakup. My manager mentioned specifically that I'd seemed more decisive and clearer in the back half of the year. I don't know if it was connected, but I think there's something to operating from a cleaner internal signal. Money took about a year to fully recover from. I had to rebuild the savings account alone. That stung in a specific, ongoing way that was different from the emotional stuff. Every time I moved money into savings, I thought about what should have been there that wasn't. I don't think about her the way I used to. There was a long stretch where she was the first thing in my head in the morning and the last at night. Not because I missed her, I was past that faster than I expected, but because I was still processing everything. Still running it through, looking for the moment I should have seen, trying to understand the architecture of how it worked on me. At some point that processing slowed down and then mostly stopped. Not because I found a clean answer, but because the question stopped being urgent. She'd been cheating and calling it self-discovery. She'd been making unilateral decisions and calling it initiative. She'd spent money we'd saved together on a life she was living separately, and when I confronted it, she tried to make the confrontation the problem. That's who she was. Not the sharpest wit in the room at a summer barbecue. Not the woman who remembered small things I said. That person had been real, maybe, for a while. But the person underneath her made choices that had nothing to do with us being partners. She was always going to do what she wanted. She just needed someone stable enough to provide a foundation and flexible enough to keep from noticing until it was too late. I wasn't a victim. I want to be careful about that word. I was a person who loved someone and trusted them, and they took advantage of that. That's not weakness. But I did spend too long making excuses for things that didn't require excuses. I mistook tolerance for maturity and patience for love, and by the time I caught up to the truth, a lot had already happened. What I can tell you is that on the other side of it, the world looks different than it did. Not better in some simple, grateful way, just different, clearer. I know now what my own perceptions feel like when I'm trusting them. I know what it feels like to ask a question and expect a straight answer and feel entitled to one. I'm dating someone now. We've been together about 8 months. She's straightforward in a way I didn't even know to look for before. She says what she thinks. She makes decisions and checks with me first. When we disagree, she says so and we work it out and then it's done. It sounds so basic. I know it sounds basic, but after Simone, basic felt like the rarest possible thing. I'm not writing this to get anyone to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for myself, not anymore. I'm writing it because I spent a lot of time searching for stories like mine when I was in the middle of it, looking for some proof that someone else had been through something like this and had come out okay on the other side. This is my contribution to that pile. The savings rebuilt. The credit score recovered. The friend group rearranged itself around the truth. Simone lost the people she'd worked hardest to keep, and she lost them because she'd underestimated how tired people get of a performance when they finally see it clearly. And me, I found out what I'm made of. Not because the situation was dramatic or extreme, but because I had to stand in a room full of people I knew and say what was true when the easier thing would have been to stay quiet and protect the surface. I walked out of Jamie and Kyra's party that night feeling worse than I'd ever felt in the relationship. And then I went home and I sat in my car for a while, and then I went inside and I slept for 10 hours, which was more than I'd slept in weeks. That's the thing about telling the truth after a long time of not being able to. It's exhausting, and then it's the best rest you've had in years. That's the whole story.